Okay, so to apply the sealer, there's a couple of different ways. The first thing you want to do is paint your piece and let it dry for at least 24 hours beforehand, because even if it feels dry to the touch, sometimes it's still a little damp, or like the paint underneath the top layer is wet, and when you go to put the sealer on, you can actually smudge your paint. So make sure it's completely dry for at least a day. And then for something smaller or 3D like this, you can just brush it on. So I just take a brush and brush it on. A couple of things. One is this sealer starts to dry pretty quick. So if you are continuously going over the same spot, it's going to cause streaks and lines, and like it's going to get really tacky and gross. So you'd want to avoid overworking it. You kind of want to put it in a spot, spread it out, and move on. The other thing is you don't want your sealer to be really thick. So if you got the kit like a little while ago and you haven't used it, and if you take you take your sealer and turn it, you do want it to move. Like, you don't want it to be like pudding. If it's pudding, it's probably thickened up a little bit. You do want it to have some movement in it. So you can see, like, as I'm moving this, you don't want it to be as thin as like milk or water. It's almost like a heavy cream, maybe a little bit thicker than a heavy cream. But you don't want it to be like molasses or like honey, where it's just like way too thick and it's not going to come out. If it is kind of thick, add just a drop, like a little tiny bit of water in here. So if you open this up, and literally I like put my brush in water and like add a drop. I'm not going to add any because mine's not thickened up, but I literally just like add a drop and then close it back up really good and then shake it up. If you add too much water, what's going to happen is it's going to dilute it too much, and then it won't be super shiny when it's dry and you put it on. So just a little tiny drop of water, and then just kind of shake it and then let it sit, because if you shake it too vigorous, you might get bubbles. So just do a little shake and then let it sit for a minute to settle so that there's no bubbles. And then we're just going to paint it on. Now for something like this, I'm probably gonna have to paint it in kind of two parts because there's no real place for me to hold it and paint at the same time. So I'll paint him, let it dry, and then I can come back and hold him and paint the rest of it. Whoop. So I'm just gonna dip my brush in and then just start painting, and I want to work kind of fast. And I've noticed that I'm not going over the same spots multiple times. I'm just going over it enough to spread it out and make sure. You don't want to leave any like rivers. And if you notice that it's kind of sticky or tacky, or like it's a little bit thicker, you can just kind of add just a touch of water. So I'm not putting a lot on at once. I'm just taking a little bit on my brush, putting it on and spreading it out, because if you put a lot on, you're gonna get those rivers and those divots. So just a little bit at a time, and don't go over the same spot multiple times. Now if you notice, like say you just did his whole hat and you were like, oh, I missed the spot up here that you did a minute ago. Don't go and try and touch that up right now, because it's tacky and it's going to cause give you some weird lines and issues. So what you can do is just let it dry and then go back in and touch it up afterwards. And then just kind of keep going. Just making sure you're spreading it out, not leaving any like divots of paint, and not going over it. That's really the trick, is just using a little bit to spread out, not going back and forth over it, and not leaving divots. If you're not putting too much paint on there, and if you're spreading it out, you won't get those divots. You will always kind of have like the brush stroke look, just because of that's just how it is. It's the nature of painting with acrylics and sealer. but it's going to be a little bit more even and covered for you. It takes 24 hours to fully cure, but normally it doesn't take that long to dry to the touch so that you could go back in and add or finish it off or touch up if you missed a spot, which I did. I did actually miss a spot right there. It's kind of hard to see while you're doing it if you missed a spot. So that's why I just kind of wait, let it dry, and then come back in and touch it up if I need to. So I'll set that aside, let it dry for maybe like an hour or so. Rinse your brush really well because the sealer will dry on your brush too. If you're doing like a larger 3D piece, say if you had something like this, I would do it the same way, except just work in sections. And then I would like maybe every couple minutes or so, just rinse and dry my brush just so that it, sometimes the amount of sealer that's on your brush, if you're like keep going and going, this starts to dry on your brush and it gets a little tacky, so you can rinse it in your water and then keep going. If you are doing something like a flatter surface like this, you can still definitely do it that same way with the brush and just kind of doing sections and spreading it out. But sometimes it's like too hard to do all at once with a brush like that. So what you can do is actually use your sponge. So I'm gonna pour out some of the sealer onto my plate here. And I'm gonna take my sponge and I'm gonna dip it in water. So I'm just dipping it in the water and then I'm gonna squeeze it out just so that the sponge absorbs the water and it gets damp. But we don't really want it like soaking with water. Like I'm kind of squeezing all of the water out. And then I'm gonna use this damp sponge to cover the whole tile. Now this tile was done with a marker. So after I was done, I took a marker and like colored in these lines here. So I'm just gonna take and dip it in and kind of swirl it around. And then I'm gonna take on here and press down and go across. And I'm just gonna do that a couple of times and then move on to the next section. Like if you keep going back and forth over it, again, you're gonna get that streaks all in it. Once you've done one layer like that, we'll let it dry. If it is a little streaky, you can take a little extra water and go over it again just to make sure. But you have to do it like immediately, otherwise you're gonna ruin it. But let that dry. Rinse out your sponge really well. And then once it's dry, you can do another layer. And then let it dry for at least 24 hours and then it's good to go.